I stood frozen, fists clenched, as bulldozers ripped through the rich, dark soil of my family's farmland. The sound of metal grinding against earth echoed like a funeral dirge, drowning out the memories etched into every inch of land, the laughter of children playing, the sweat poured into planting and harvest, the legacy of my grandfather who had treasured this land as sacred. It was more than just property. It was history, love, hope, all now being consumed by an unyielding machine fueled by greed. Mrs. Jenkins and her cohorts in the HOA had orchestrated this travesty with cold precision, bypassing all decency to pave over what was rightfully mine. I could barely comprehend the betrayal. Despite holding permits and proof of ownership, I was stripped of my rights in an instant. They had played their cards well, manipulating zoning laws and using every underhanded tactic available to them. The shock coursed through me like electricity, igniting a fire of defiance within. As the bulldozers continued their relentless assault, I felt a swell of anger rise up from somewhere deep inside. Their arrogance, believing they could take what belonged to my family, fueled my determination to fight back. They may have thought they were untouchable, ensconced within their gated community of privilege and entitlement, but beneath their facade of power lay a tangled web of corruption waiting to be unraveled. Days turned into sleepless nights as I dug deeper into their operations. I pored over documents, discovered the trails of bribery leading back to municipal offices, exposed collusion with city officials who turned a blind eye for a price. Each revelation stoked the flames of my resolve. I knew that my grandfather would never have backed down, neither would I. The day came when I decided that enough was enough. Armed with heavy machinery, plans crafted from meticulous research, and a burning desire to reclaim my legacy, I set my plan into motion. Under the cloak of night, I made my move, stealthily approaching their headquarters, a building that had become a fortress of deceit. As dawn broke, the sun's first rays illuminated the chaos I had unleashed. The proud HOA headquarters lay in ruins, their sense of invincibility shattered like glass. Excited murmurs spread through the community as board members realized their precious control was slipping away. I smiled at the thought of their embarrassment when confronted with the evidence that would soon surface, proof of their malfeasance that would expose them to the world. I had not only taken back what was mine, I had turned their own tactics against them. Now they would know what it felt like to be powerless in the face of injustice, a lesson they sorely needed to learn. Mrs. Jenkins stood at the forefront of the HOA, her presence as imposing as the bulldozers that ravaged my family's land. With her perfectly coiffed hair and tailored suits, she radiated authority, an image of someone who relished control. Yet beneath that polished exterior lay a ruthless ambition that knew no bounds. To her, property rights were merely obstacles to be navigated, and I was just another pawn in her game. As I learned more about her methods, the layers of her ambition unraveled like a cheap suit. Mrs. Jenkins had a singular vision: to transform our once quiet neighborhood into a sprawling luxury community that catered to affluent newcomers. The bulldozers were not just machines, they were instruments of her vision, and they had no regard for the history or heart of the land they scarred. Her rise within the HOA hadn't come without sacrifices. She'd made alliances with influential figures who shared her lack of scruples, using bribery and intimidation to silence dissenters. Those who opposed her agenda found themselves facing sudden zoning changes or inexplicable fines, all carefully orchestrated to remove any threat to her plans. I had thought I was fighting against a board of faceless bureaucrats, but now it became clear. Mrs. Jenkins was the mastermind pulling all the strings. Witnessing her smug demeanor as she surveyed the destruction ignited a fire within me. She reveled in the chaos she created, believing herself untouchable within her gated fortress of privilege and power. That sense of invulnerability only fueled my resolve to dismantle her empire brick by brick. There was something deeply personal about this conflict. It was not only my land at stake, but also my family's legacy, a legacy she sought to obliterate for profit. Determined to expose her corruption, I began tracking down every lead that pointed back to Mrs. Jenkins and her shady dealings with local officials. The deeper I dug, the more tangled the web appeared. Each document I uncovered revealed how far she would go for success: manipulated contracts, inflated invoices for non-existent services, and clandestine meetings held behind closed doors, all designed to fortify her grip on power. As days turned into weeks, I documented everything meticulously. It was essential to build an unassailable case against her. The realization dawned on me. Mrs. Jenkins operated under the illusion that she was above accountability, shielded by layers of deceit and arrogance. But beneath that veneer lay cracks waiting to be exploited. The time for action approached quickly, and my resolve crystallized into a plan that would shift the balance back into my favor. I wouldn't just reclaim my land. I would ensure that Mrs. Jenkins faced the consequences of her actions as well. Little did she know that I was ready to turn her own tactics against her, proving that true power lies not in manipulation, but in justice served cold and uncompromisingly. Frustration coursed through me like a relentless tide as I grappled with the reality of my situation. I had fought hard to secure my family's land, armed with permits and documents establishing my rightful ownership. Yet, as I stood helplessly watching the bulldozers churn the earth into an unrecognizable wasteland, it became glaringly clear that paperwork meant nothing in the face of the HOA's manipulative tactics. Every piece of evidence I had meticulously gathered felt like a flimsy shield against their well-oiled machine of corruption. Mrs. Jenkins and her cronies exploited every loophole, maneuvering through zoning laws as if they were mere suggestions. They wielded power with an ease that left me feeling small and powerless. Their whispers and backroom meetings rendered me invisible in this battle for justice. What was the point of having legal rights if those rights could be so cavalierly disregarded by those with deeper pockets and dirtier hands? I couldn't help but feel a rising sense of rage directed at a system designed to protect property owners like myself, but which seemed to operate chiefly in favor of those willing to play dirty. As the dust settled around the bulldozer's devastation, I realized that my anger had transformed into something more potent, a driving determination to reclaim what had been stolen from me. In conversations with neighbors, I began to uncover stories of others who had fallen victim to Mrs. Jenkins' ruthless ambition. Families forced out by fabricated regulations, long-standing community members silenced by threats. Each tale compounded my sense of injustice. It wasn't just my family's land being stripped away. It was a pattern of exploitation that she had perfected over years, burying dissent beneath layers of deceit. With each revelation about Mrs. Jenkins' tactics, my resolve solidified further. It wasn't enough to simply hold onto the paperwork. I needed a strategy that could counteract her influence directly. The prospect of facing off against her in court, knowing how adept she was at twisting facts, felt insurmountable. The legal system, while theoretically on my side, felt rigged as if every gavel strike favored those who played the game better. Determined not to be another statistic or another family lost in Mrs. Jenkins' wake, I delved deeper into their operations and began laying out plans for a remedy of my own, one that didn't rely solely on legal arguments or courtrooms filled with polished lawyers and intimidating judges. If they thought they could strip me of everything without consequence, then they were sorely mistaken. As night descended, plans began to coalesce in my mind. Plans not just for reclamation, but for retaliation against a system that had failed me and others like me. They would learn soon enough that this fight was far from over. Determined to dismantle the HOA's grip on my family's land, I began digging into their operations with a singular purpose: to uncover the truth behind their seemingly unstoppable ambition. What started as a personal quest quickly morphed into an investigation that revealed layers of corruption beneath their polished facade. Each late night spent poring over documents and public records peeled back the layers of Mrs. Jenkins' empire, exposing a web of bribery and deceit at its core. I soon discovered that Mrs. Jenkins had crafted a network of influence that reached deep into local government. Zoning board members, city officials, and even law enforcement officers had received generous donations, securing their loyalty while she expanded her control over the neighborhood. With each lead I followed, it became clear that this wasn't just about my land. It was a systematic effort to erase anyone who dared challenge her vision for a luxury community. One evening, while sifting through stacks of files at the local courthouse, I stumbled upon a series of irregular transactions. Bank statements hinted at large sums transferred from the HOA's accounts to various unnamed individuals, ghosts in the system, carefully hidden from prying eyes. It didn't take long to piece together that these were not mere payments for services rendered. They were bribes designed to silence dissent and manipulate regulations in favor of Mrs. Jenkins' agenda. As my investigation progressed, I began to connect the dots between fraudulent invoices and zoning changes that had benefited the HOA while devastating long-standing residents like myself. It was as if I had unlocked a vault filled with secrets. The more I uncovered, the more emboldened I felt. The stories shared by my neighbors echoed in my mind. Families pressured to sell under threat of fabricated fines. Community members facing sudden zoning changes that rendered their properties worthless. Each revelation cemented my resolve to expose Mrs. Jenkins and her corrupt practices. I meticulously documented every finding, building a robust case against her that highlighted not just her actions, but also the broader implications for our community. The legal system might have seemed impenetrable, but armed with this information, I could turn the tide. Knowledge was power, and in this battle against corruption, I would wield it like a weapon. In moments of quiet reflection, I imagined Mrs. Jenkins' reaction when faced with irrefutable evidence of her wrongdoings. The thought fueled my ambition even more. She believed herself untouchable, shielded by wealth and influence. But what she didn't realize was that her empire was built on shaky ground. I was prepared to expose her network of lies and manipulation, revealing the truth not just for my sake, but for all those she had wronged. The pieces were falling into place for a reckoning that would shake the foundations of her carefully constructed world. It was time to bring her dark dealings into the light and ensure she could no longer hide behind her deceitful facade. The path ahead would demand courage and resolve, but I was ready to take the fight directly to her doorstep. After all, she had underestimated me for too long. Now it was her turn to face the consequences. With a fire ignited in my heart, I realized that reclaiming my family's land would require more than just righteous anger. It necessitated a strategic plan that would send a clear message to the HOA and Mrs. Jenkins. I had gathered critical evidence exposing their corruption, but now it was time to translate that knowledge into action. A proactive approach rather than merely sitting back and hoping for justice. In the solitude of late nights, I sketched out what the HOA's downfall could look like. The empty office building they operated from became a focal point in my mind, an undeniable symbol of their manipulative reign. If they thought they could destroy my family's legacy without consequences, then they were sorely mistaken. Armed with heavy machinery and a detailed blueprint of my plan, I began to outline a course of action that wouldn't depend solely on legalities. I envisioned striking under the cover of darkness, a moment when they would least expect it. Leveraging my connections in the community, I sourced equipment discreetly. I wasn't just preparing for immediate destruction. I was ensuring that what replaced their headquarters would serve as a clear proclamation of ownership, one that all who passed by would see and understand. Each step was calculated, aimed not at chaos for chaos's sake, but at reclaiming power and shaking the foundations of their corruption. Simultaneously, I intensified my investigation into Mrs. Jenkins' dealings. The more I uncovered about her backroom deals and connections with corrupt officials, the more emboldened I grew. With each piece of evidence meticulously documented, not only the bribery, but also how she pressured local officials to bend or break regulations, I prepared an extensive dossier that painted a comprehensive portrait of her wrongdoing. I knew this evidence would be invaluable, not merely to dismantle her operations, but also to rally support from other affected community members who had remained silent out of fear. They needed to see that standing up against her was no longer a lost cause. This new wave of determination invigorated me. It created a sense of solidarity amongst neighbors who had questioned whether their voices could ever matter against such entrenched power. The plan came together seamlessly as everything fell into place. the machinery acquired, the documents organized for public exposure, and allies enlisted in anticipation of the fallout. My resolve hardened. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. Not just for me, but for everyone Mrs. Jenkins had trampled on during her rise to power. As night approached, I felt an exhilarating rush when considering the imminent changes that awaited both the HOA and myself. This was only the beginning, the first decisive blow against oppression disguised as governance. A smile crept across my face as I realized that they would soon understand the strength of collective resilience and determination. Up until now, they'd underestimated the lengths I was willing to go to protect what was mine. It would be a true reckoning, and soon enough, they would learn what it meant to face those they thought powerless. As darkness enveloped the neighborhood, I felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through me, propelling me forward into action. The extensive planning was set to culminate tonight. Every detail had been carefully considered during countless sleepless nights. Armed with heavy machinery, I approached the HOA office under the cloak of night, a structure that had become a symbol not just of their power, but of my lost heritage. My heart raced as I climbed into the cab of the bulldozer, its enormous frame looming like a silent guardian ready to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The shadows around me felt alive, whispering encouragement as I initiated the machinery's rumble. It was time for a reckoning, time to expose Mrs. Jenkins and the insidious network she commanded. With each shift of the controls, the office building trembled, its walls shaking under the weight of justice long overdue. I felt a mix of exhilaration and fear. This act would be both liberation and declaration. The first wall came crashing down with a resounding thud, sending debris flying into the air like confetti celebrating a hard-won battle. The relentless sound of destruction echoed through the stillness of the night, drowning out any lingering doubts. As bits of plaster and brick fell away, it felt as if bricks were also being lifted off my shoulders. The burden of helplessness that had weighed me down for so long evaporated with each collapse. This was more than just an act of demolition. It was a bold statement against oppression and manipulation. Each piece that fell carried with it years of trauma, the history of my family shattered by greed and deceit. The plan didn't only involve tearing down their headquarters. It included laying down something far more meaningful in its place. With quick-dry cement prepared on standby, I envisioned a new parking lot emerging where their headquarters once stood, a clean, solid foundation that would serve as a physical embodiment of ownership and defiance. This space would bear witness not only to their downfall, but to my resurrection. Hours melted away as I worked methodically, each movement precise, as I poured concrete into freshly framed spaces marked on the ground. By dawn, I envisioned an expansive lot already lined with painted spaces and adorned with bold signage declaring private property. No HOA access. When morning light broke over the horizon, I wanted to ensure that all who passed by could see the stark transformation from corporate hubris to community reclamation. Finally finishing just before dawn, I wiped sweat from my brow and stepped back to admire my handiwork. The remnants of the old office lay scattered around like forgotten relics of an oppressive reign. As light filled the sky, reality set in. By sunrise, there would be no denying what had just occurred. The impending chaos among the HOA members was palpable. They would arrive to find not only their headquarters reduced to rubble, but also a garden of resilience where their authority once festered. With law enforcement potentially breathing down their necks due to fraudulent dealings unearthed through my investigation, they would grasp that this was merely the beginning for them, and that someone had finally stood up against their tyranny. I smiled at this thought. They had played dirty in their pursuit for power, but they had no idea what real repercussions looked like. Justice was being served cold, and it would be a lesson they would remember for years to come. As dawn broke over the neighborhood, the once pristine facade of the HOA office laid in ruins, a stark reminder of the power dynamics that had shifted overnight. The air buzzed with tension as board members trickled in, their faces painted with disbelief and horror. The chaos that ensued was palpable. A cacophony of shouts and frantic calls filled the streets as they grappled with their new reality. Mrs. Jenkins was among the first to arrive, her meticulously styled hair disheveled and her tailored suit contrasting sharply with the debris at her feet. She stood frozen in shock, her mouth open in a mix of outrage and confusion, unable to process how her empire could have crumbled so quickly. As her fellow board members gathered around, whispers of disbelief morphed into panicked discussions about what to do next. They were accustomed to controlling narratives, spinning stories to their advantage, but now they found themselves at the center of a whirlwind beyond their manipulation. The sight of the fresh asphalt lot where their headquarters once stood served as a harsh declaration, one that proclaimed my ownership and marked their defeat. The painted lines and bold sign reading private property, no HOA access only deepened their humiliation. It was a public affront that would echo through the community for years to come. Reporters arrived in droves, smartphones capturing every moment of Mrs. Jenkins' unraveling as snippets of their fraudulent activities began spilling into the public eye. With microphones thrust in her face, she sputtered accusations of vandalism, but each word felt weak against the backdrop of undeniable destruction. Law enforcement arrived soon after, evidently tipped off by the evidence I had gathered. The officers moved methodically, speaking quietly among themselves while reviewing documents that linked her to illicit transactions. I could only imagine how it felt for Mrs. Jenkins to stand there, the puppet master now bound by threads she had woven herself. As chaos escalated within the HOA ranks, my heart raced with satisfaction. There was a certain pride in knowing that I was no longer the powerless victim. I had turned the tables on those who had preyed on my family for far too long. The spectacle before me was not just about revenge. It was about reclaiming agency over my life and legacy. The community began to take notice. Neighbors who had long feared voicing their concerns about the HOA's overreach now gathered at a safe distance, murmurs of support building amongst them. I could see them exchanging glances, some nodding in agreement as if awakening from a trance. They understood now that if one person could stand up against Mrs. Jenkins' tyranny, maybe they too could reclaim their voices. With reporters continuing to dig deeper into the HOA's corrupt dealings, I savored every moment of their exposure. Their downfall was no longer just an abstract concept, but a vibrant reality unfolding before everyone's eyes. This wasn't merely an end, but the beginning of a new chapter for our community. A chapter where corruption wouldn't reign unchallenged, and where ordinary residents wielded power over those who had long exploited them. As I watched the sun rise higher in the sky, illuminating both the new parking lot and the faces of my neighbors illuminated with newfound hope, I realized this was only the start of something much larger than myself. The tide had turned. Together we could dismantle their legacy and build one rooted in justice and integrity. What felt like a final act of defiance had transformed into a movement, one born from resilience and fueled by truth, and it would shake the very foundations of what they had built. As the dust settled around the remnants of the HOA office, the media descended like vultures, eager to cover the unfolding scandal. Reporters crowded around Mrs. Jenkins and her disoriented board members, their cameras capturing every moment of chaos and disbelief. The narrative had shifted dramatically. No longer were they the untouchable elite dictating terms to the community, but rather the exposed actors in a drama of their own making. Snippets of conversations and accusations flew through the air as the journalists probed deeper, asking pointed questions that highlighted the corruption lurking beneath the surface. Mrs. Jenkins' attempts to downplay her predicament fell flat under the weight of evidence already circulating among them. They began to uncover connections between her and the illegal dealings tied to the HOA's recent actions, bribery, manipulation of zoning laws, and threats against residents who dared to voice dissent. The once comfortable shroud of authority she wore began to fray, revealing vulnerabilities that had remained hidden for far too long. I watched from a distance, satisfaction blooming within me as I recalled the painstaking hours spent gathering evidence against her. The documents I had collected became critical pieces in this burgeoning narrative of corruption, a narrative that was no longer confined to the shadows, but now stood in glaring daylight. Reporters began to reference the fraudulent land deeds and bank transfers, linking Mrs. Jenkins directly to her unscrupulous activities. amplifying the community's outrage as they learned of her deceitful methods. The attention of the media transformed my personal battle into a public spectacle that reverberated through the neighborhood. People who had once felt powerless against the HOA's overreach now found their voices amplifying alongside mine, buoyed by a sense of collective empowerment ignited by these revelations. It wasn't just about my reclaimed land anymore. It was about bringing justice to everyone affected by Mrs. Jenkins' tyranny. As interviews unfolded, I noticed neighbors emerging from their homes, drawn in by the commotion and the promise of change. The stories began cascading through the crowd, shared experiences of intimidation and coercion that echoed my own. The more reporters uncovered about Mrs. Jenkins, the more emboldened our community became. Suddenly, speaking out against her reign didn't feel like an act of defiance. It felt like a necessary revolution. With every news segment aired, Mrs. Jenkins' empire crumbled further in public perception. As law enforcement moved in to investigate not only her actions, but also those of her complicit board members, I found a renewed sense of hope among my neighbors. This was no longer merely a personal vendetta. It was a collective stand against corruption that promised to reshape our community. The day wore on, and as more footage surfaced, video clips showing Mrs. Jenkins stumbling through her defenses, the realization struck me. Real justice was unfolding right before our eyes. The media frenzy ensured that her transgressions would not be easily forgotten. They would serve as a cautionary tale for those who believe themselves above reproach. This newfound exposure represented not only a shift in power dynamics, but a chance for our community to reclaim agency over our lives and values. United by this shared purpose, we could dismantle an oppressive regime and lay the groundwork for transparency and integrity. What had begun with one act of defiance had transformed into a movement poised to thrive long after this day was over, a testament to resilience in the face of injustice that would echo throughout our town for generations to come. In the days following the chaos at the demolished HOA office, the tide finally turned in my favor. As law enforcement combed through the wreckage, they began to piece together the evidence I had gathered against Mrs. Jenkins and her corrupt board members. The atmosphere in the community was electric with anticipation. Everyone was eager to see justice served. I could feel a palpable shift in the air, a collective hope that something meaningful was about to unfold. Weeks later, I received a call from my attorney, who had been diligently working to reaffirm my legal claim to the land. The court date had arrived, a moment I had envisioned countless times during my sleepless nights, filled with dreams of reclaiming my family's legacy. Armed with the evidence I'd collected, not just of my ownership, but also of the HOA's transgressions, I braced myself for what lay ahead. Walking into the courthouse felt surreal. The walls seemed to close in around me as memories of what had been stolen flashed before my eyes. Summers spent on the land, laughter shared with family under the shade of old trees now buried beneath asphalt. I was determined to reclaim not just property, but a part of myself, a legacy forged by my grandfather through hard work and love. As I took my seat, I was struck by how different this moment felt compared to those previous encounters, where I was always on the defensive. This time, I was not merely standing up for what was mine. I was exposing a web of deceit that extended far beyond my situation. When the judge entered, silence settled over the courtroom. With a deep breath, I prepared to present my case. The evidence unfolded methodically, led by my attorney's compelling arguments, supported by photographs, documents, and testimonies from neighbors who had once feared speaking out. Each piece fell into place like a jigsaw puzzle, revealing a picture of corruption and malfeasance. The fraudulent land deeds and bank transfers linked directly to Mrs. Jenkins painted a vivid portrait of her unscrupulous dealings. As we reached the conclusion of our presentation, it became increasingly clear that Mrs. Jenkins' facade had crumbled under scrutiny. The tables had turned. She no longer held power over me or anyone else in our community. There wasn't a single flicker of confidence left in her demeanor as she faced me across the courtroom. Moments later, when the judge delivered his ruling, affirming my legal ownership of the land, I felt a rush of vindication wash over me. It wasn't simply about regaining control. It was about justice being served on behalf of everyone who had suffered under Mrs. Jenkins' oppressive rule. Cheers erupted from supporters gathered outside after hearing the verdict. They understood that this moment marked more than just one victory. It symbolized a shift in power dynamics within our community. With official documentation back in hand and control re-established over my family's land, I knew it was time to look forward rather than dwell on what had been lost. The empty space where the HOA office once stood would serve as more than just a new parking lot. It would become a testament to resilience against corruption and manipulation. I envisioned organizing community events on my land, gathering neighbors for celebrations that honored unity and transparency, a stark contrast to the fear and intimidation tactics that had previously defined our interactions with the HOA. It was time to build something lasting from this experience, something that would ensure no one else would have to endure what we had faced. This journey transformed me from a victim into an advocate for justice, an agent of change fueled by resolve and hope. With every step forward, the reclamation of land, community support galvanized by truth, I felt invigorated by the promise that we could shape our own destinies free from oppression. Justice had not only been served, it had opened doors to new possibilities for all of us willing to stand together against wrongdoing. As the dust settled on this tumultuous chapter of my life, I stood at the edge of my family's land, surveying the newly paved parking lot where the HOA office once stood. The feeling of reclaiming not just property, but a legacy filled me with a profound sense of fulfillment. This was more than a personal victory. It symbolized resilience, justice, and empowerment for everyone in our community who had felt the oppressive weight of corruption. The legal battle that had culminated with my ownership being legally reaffirmed served as a powerful reminder that standing up for what is right can lead to meaningful change. With every piece of evidence I had gathered, I had not only regained control over my family's land, but also exposed the deep-rooted corruption that had prevailed for far too long. It was a triumph of integrity over deceit. The community around me thrived on this newfound energy, emboldened by the collective realization that they too could challenge injustice. People who had once been silenced by fear now stepped forward, sharing their own stories of oppression at the hands of the HOA and Mrs. Jenkins. Together, we were dismantling a system that had long sought to undermine our voices. We learned that unity could amplify our strength and ensure that no one would be trampled underfoot again. With each passing day, plans began to take shape for transforming my reclaimed land into a space that celebrated community spirit. A park, perhaps, where laughter would replace intimidation, and where families could gather to create memories instead of living in fear. My vision expanded beyond mere reclamation. It evolved into an aspiration for something greater, a vibrant hub for unity and resilience that served as a permanent fixture against corruption. I envisioned organizing events to educate neighbors about their rights and promote transparency in local governance. Workshops would empower residents to voice their concerns without fear of retribution. By fostering open dialogue among community members, we could establish a foundation built on trust and mutual respect, ensuring that every individual's voice mattered. As I reflected on this journey from victimhood to advocacy, I recognized just how transformative it had been not only for me, but for everyone around me. My fight against Mrs. Jenkins' tyranny had ignited a collective resolve that underscored the importance of courage in confronting oppression. Justice was not merely an abstract concept. It was now a lived experience that resonated through our community. This chapter closed with the assurance that real change was possible when individuals dared to stand up against wrongdoing. The struggles we faced would not be forgotten. They formed the bedrock of our community's future resilience. In reclaiming my land, I had also rekindled hope and determination within those around me. As I looked out at the fresh asphalt glimmering in the sunlight, it felt like more than just a parking lot. It symbolized liberation, a badge of honor worn by every resident willing to fight for their truth. Together, we would continue this journey towards justice, ensuring that no matter how insurmountable the odds seemed, we would always rise together to reclaim what is rightfully ours. The path ahead was brightened by our shared commitment to integrity and defiance against all forms of corruption, an unwavering testament to our strength and resilience.